Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another discussion video in which I'll be talking about Charles Dickens's Bleak House as part of my ongoing series for the very long Victorian-style serialised read-along that I'm currently hosting of Bleak House. I must confess, a little bit behind with Bleak House currently, but I'm sure I will catch up in the next month. So this video is not on October's chapters, but on September's chapters, and then I'm reading October's chapters at the moment in the beginning of November, and that video should be up along with the video on November's chapters before the end of this month, all being well. We will see. It's been a quite frantic time lately. However, in the month of September, we read Chapter 20, A New Lodger, Chapter 21, The Smallweed Family, and Chapter 22, Mr. Bucket. It's so weird to think that you're quite a substantial way through the book and there are still so many new characters being introduced who, for me, having read Bleak House before, like I know how pivotal and important they are, and they feel like really not huge, they're not the main characters, but they are quite important, and it's quite late into the story that they actually get introduced. So a lot of new people to talk to about today, and no Esther today either, so let's get straight into those chapters. To start off with Chapter 20, A New Lodger. In this chapter we mostly follow Mr. Guppy. He is working, as always, at Kensington Carboys and has now been joined by Richard, who he's not that keen on because he considers Richard a bit of a swell or someone a bit too posh and fancy for the likes of Mr. Guppy. But anyway, Mr. Guppy leaves the office and encounters a friend of his called Bart Smallweed, who is a very young man, pretty much a teenager, but acts far above his years and certainly seems to have never been a child, as Dickens would put it. And together they encounter a third young man called Tony Jobling. Now Tony Jobling, it appears, was once working in the same office as Mr. Guppy but got into trouble. He lived a very extravagant lifestyle and since then has been kind of struggling to get money and struggling to get a job and struggling to find a place for himself. So he turns up randomly. The two other young men haven't seen him for a while, and so Mr. Guppy buys him dinner and drink, quite a lot of dinner and drink in fact, and they discuss what Tony Jobling should do next. And Guppy suggests that Jobling could really do no worse than get some copying work with Snagsby, the law stationer, who we have encountered many times before, and then in fact there is an empty room going free for renting in Mr. Crook's shop, which is quite near where Mr. Snagsby lived. And okay, so the man who lived there previously did die, possibly at his own hand, and it has some gloomy connotations, which means the man is struggling to let it, but really Jobling is really not that bad. And Jobling really doesn't mind that a man has died there, especially as he can get it at quite a good rent, and so he ends up going to live in Mr. Crook's shop. Tony Jobling, still being rather in debt, takes on the name of Mr. Weevil so that his creditors cannot track him, but also being rather a charming young man, he decides to try and be as nice to Mr. Crook as possible and to get on his good side as much as possible, because it is rumoured that Mr. Crook has a lot of money and Jobling would rather like quite a lot of that money. So, points of interest in this chapter. Mr. Guppy is both kind of a comic and a slightly tragic character in Dickens. He is a little bit broken-hearted that Esther Summerson did not accept his offer of marriage, but he's very, very melodramatic in his misery. He talks about a shadow on my existence and says that he knows Mr. Crook has some money and that it might be very much worth Mr. Jobling's while to hang around Mr. Crook, and it's the kind of thing he might be interested in doing himself, but alas, he does not feel quite up to the task. If I had the energy I once possessed, Tony, but there are chords in the human mind. I also want to talk a bit about the character of Bart Smallweed. Now the Smallweeds are a very odd and interesting family who I'll go on to talk about in the next chapter as well, but Bart Smallweed is quite an interesting character, especially. Whether young Smallweed was ever a boy is much doubted in Lincoln's Inn. He is now something under 15, and an old limb at the law. He is facetiously understood to entertain a passion for a lady at a cigar shop in the neighbourhood of Chancery Lane, and for her sake to have broken off a contract with another lady to whom he has been engaged some years. He is a town-made article of small stature and weazened features, but may be perceived from a considerable distance by means of his very tall hat. To become a Guppy is the object of his ambition. He dresses at that gentleman by whom he is patronised, talks at him, walks at him, founds himself entirely on him. He is honoured with Mr. Guppy's particular confidence and occasionally advises him from the deep wells of his experience on difficult points in private life. Dickens writes quite interestingly in several of his novels about what I think is best to describe as old children. Children who seem very much older than their years and behave very much as though they were adults. We have Jenny Wren in Our Mutual Friend, we have Bart Smallweed and Judy Smallweed in here, we have to an extent Paul Dombey in Dombey and Son, and I'm sure I'm missing several others. So it's quite an interesting technique, I think, to write about sort of childhood and how certain situations in the Victorian world made adults of children before their time, effectively, especially as characters like Bart and Judy and like Jenny Wren come from fairly difficult sort of backgrounds. They're not treated by their parents and guardians as children, and therefore they sort of become old much more before their time. Bart Smallweed behaves as though he is much older than his years, and as we see later in this chapter, is kind of attracted to women in their sort of 40s, though he's like 15, because he doesn't view himself as 15, he views himself as being much older than that. He stands precociously possessed of centuries of owlish wisdom. If he ever lay in a cradle, it seems as if he must have lain there in a tailcoat. He has an old, old eye, has Smallweed, and he drinks and he smokes in a monkeyish way, and his neck is stiff in his collar, and he is never to be taken in, and he knows all about it, whatever it is. Again, that line actually really reminds me of Jenny Wren in Our Mutual Friend. I haven't noticed the similarities in certain descriptions of them so far, so I'm gonna look out for that later. It's been quite a while since I read this. I don't remember if I like Bart Smallweed that much. I remember Grandfather Smallweed much more vividly than I do Bart Smallweed. But that bit where he says, that he knows all about it, whatever it is, reminds me of Jenny Wren in Our Mutual Friend saying, I know your tricks and your manners, or whatever it is she says. And to fit in with the theme of sort of age that goes throughout this chapter, the fact that Bart acts so much older than he is, Jobling, when he is eating his dinner, says that he's sort of growing older, and he says, I'm growing up, I've become a man again, when he sort of feels full and has had his dinner. I want to talk a little bit about why Mr. Jobling was dismissed from his job at Kenjan Carboys, because it's not exactly clear. And when it came to creditors making rows at the office, and to people that the office dealt with making complaints about dirty trifles of borrowed money, why there was an end of that connection, and of any new professional connection too. For if I was to give a reference tomorrow, it would be mentioned and would sew me up. The question is whether he has been dismissed from Kenjan Carboys because he was heavily in debt, or whether he has stolen money from Kenjan Carboys in order to pay his debt. I don't know. That line about dirty trifles of borrowed money sounds like something extra dodgy and slightly worse than him just being in debt. It's hard to know, but I think it's quite interesting to note. One thing I think is quite interesting to look at with these three men is their sort of class and social position. Guppy, Jobling and Bart Smallweed are all effectively in the lower middle class. What Guppy is doing as a clerk, it is educated work in which he writes and reads and works in an office, but he doesn't have very much money and he's not very high up in society, nor is Jobling. Well, Jobling has pretty much next to no money now, though he does have education and fashion. Right now he has absolutely no money. He's nearly as poor as Joe, the crossing sweeper boy, but because he has an education and can get money as a copywriter, he is better off, and his sort of class position can help him to not sink so low on the poverty scale. We learn in the next chapter that Bart works at a scrivener's office. That is what he does for a living, but he is also very happy to dine at Guppy's expense wherever possible. But their place is very much in the lower middle class. None of them have very much money to spend. None of them live a very sort of high-flying social society London lives, but they all are educated, and although they don't have much money, they're in a very different world from people like Jenny and Joe. Before I move on to the next chapter, I also want to talk a little bit about Mr. Crook and Mr. Crook's shop. It's interesting to see how other characters view Mr. Crook. Guppy certainly thinks that Crook must know a lot that other people don't, and that he must have a lot of secrets and a lot of money hidden somewhere within that crazy shop. He's the most extraordinary old chap, sir. I don't know but what it might be worth a fellow's while to look him up a bit. And yet the shop itself is horrible, and the way Dickens describes the atmosphere is just fantastic. The unwholesome air is so stained with this liquor that even the green eyes on the cat upon her shelf as they open and shut and glimmer on the visitors look drunk. When they try to wake Mr. Crook from his sleep, it would seem as easy to wake a bundle of old clothes with a spirituous heat smouldering in it. And when he wakes, he is so confused that he tries to punch Guppy and Jobling, and then turns round and is rather pleased to see them as soon as he knows that Guppy is going to bring him some alcohol. You get a sense of his reliance on alcohol, and also how he is sort of constantly drunk and often asleep. But despite Guppy sort of knowing that he is very often drunk, very often asleep, and is very old, Guppy also feels that Crook knows something and knows things that will be worth someone knowing. And I think that's pretty much all I want to say on that chapter, so next we'll move on to chapter 21, the Smallweed family. In this chapter we are introduced to the Smallweed family. Obviously we've already met Bart, but in this chapter we get to know his sister Judy Smallweed and also his grandparents, grandfather and grandmother Smallweed. For the purposes of this video and all the rest of this series of videos, I'm going to call Bart Smallweed Bart and the grandfather Smallweed Mr. Smallweed, because that is how I think of them in my head. After we're introduced to the Smallweed family, I get a sense of their slightly sad, miserable family life in which none of them have any imagination nor any happiness and are not very nice people to each other and to anybody else. And then Mr. George comes in. Now I love Mr. George, he's one of my favourite characters in all of Dickens, so we'll talk a lot about Mr. George as the book goes on, but for now I just see in my book where I annotate, it says Mr. George walks in, and I just wrote yay with 3 smiley faces, so That's all I have to say about that. Mr. George seems to owe some money to Mr. Smallweed. Mr. Smallweed pretends to be a middleman and says that in fact George owes money to his friend in the city, though it's pretty clear that George owes money to him that George cannot quite always afford to pay, but he comes in and he pays his interest, and it becomes clear that he's got involved with this money he owes to Smallweed through some complication to do with an old friend of his called Captain Horden, who he says is dead and was drowned several years ago. It's not entirely clear here, and to be honest, it's been a while since I read the book all the way through and I can't precisely remember the circumstances, but it seems like George may be paying back a loan of Captain Horden's rather than a loan of his own taking. And then Mr. George goes home to his shooting gallery where we also meet his friend Phil Squad. So let's talk about points of interest in this chapter. There are quite a few. First, just the description of the Smallweed family in general and their sort of family characteristics I find really, really interesting, and also reminds me quite a lot of Charles Dickens' novel Hard Times, where he talks a lot about the kind of starvation of the imagination, I suppose, where he talks quite a lot about the education of children to not have imagination and the kind of damaging effects that has on children. There has only been one child in the Smallweed family for several generations. Little old men and old women there have been, but no child until Mr. Smallweed, that's Bart's grandmother, now living, became weak in her intellect and fell for the first time into a childish state. During the whole time consumed in the slow growth of this family tree, the house of Smallweed, always early to go out and late to marry, has strengthened itself in its practical character, has discarded all amusements, discounted all storybooks, fairy tales, fictions and fables, and banished all levities whatever. Hence the gratifying fact that it has had no child born to it, and that the complete little men and women whom it has produced have been observed to bear a likeness to old monkeys, with something depressing on their minds. Judy never owned a toy, never heard of Cinderella, but never played at any games. She once or twice fell into children's company when she was about 10 years old, but the children couldn't get on with Judy, and Judy couldn't get on with them. It is very doubtful whether Judy knows how to laugh. She has so rarely seen the thing done that the probabilities are strong the other way. Judy's not that nice a character, she's pretty cruel to their servant Charlie, but you also feel pretty sorry for her when you read that paragraph and get a sense of how blank her life and her childhood has been, starved of imagination, as Charles Dickens also talks about a lot in Hard Times. It's a real kind of critique of his in several of his books, the way that children are treated and not allowed to play and have any imagination, and how the kind of rationalisation and industrialisation of the Victorian period to Dickens means that there is a kind of idea of industrialization of the mind, which means that people feel they have to be really more practical and therefore kind of imagination is really discouraged. It's a big theme in Hard Times, and it's interesting to see how it comes in here in Bleak House as well. But still, it remains the fact that Judy is not terribly nice, and when she's instructing their servant girl Charlie, and Charlie says she's cleaning the upstairs back room, Judy replies, "Mind you do it thoroughly and don't loiter, shirking won't do for me. Make haste to go along, you girls are more trouble than you're worth by half." This sounds like it's coming from a fairly old woman, but it's not. It's coming from a 15-year-old girl. Now let's look at the character of Grandfather Smallweed, or Mr. Smallweed, as I said I'm going to call him, because he is quite an interesting character and he is quite important throughout the rest of the book. I talked about Mr. Smallweed quite recently in a video I made on this channel for Victober, in which I discussed the presentation of characters with disabilities and physical deformities in Victorian literature. I'm going to link that video down below because I talk a lot about the kind of general presentation of characters with disabilities in Victorian literature. There is a common trope within Victorian literature of characters with disabilities being villains, and Mr. Smallweed definitely falls into that. Mr. Smallweed is mostly paralysed. Dickens says he is in a helpless condition as to his lower and nearly so as to his upper limbs, but his mind is unimpaired. And certainly within Bleak House, Mr. Smallweed's disability is kind of bound up with his villainy and the way he is portrayed. Dickens makes efforts to describe him in a fairly sort of inhuman way at times. He's described as being like a broken puppet or a mere clothes bag with a black skull cap on the top of it. And he is certainly not a very nice man. We see him very early on in this chapter abusing his wife who has dementia, throwing things at her and shouting at her when she begins to talk. And we also get the impression that he is very, very miserly. He is in many ways quite like the character of Scrooge. He is a moneylender. He has no time for people who won't pay it back. He believes in spending as little money as possible, and when Bart tells him that he's been dining at Mr. Guppy's expense, his grandfather is very proud. Live at his expense as much as you can and take warning by his foolish example. That's the use of such a friend, the only use you can put him to. But unlike Scrooge, and more like Fascination Fledgeby in Our Mutual Friend, Mr. Smallweed is a moneylender who refuses to admit to other people that he is a moneylender. He pretends to be a middleman to Mr. George and says that it's his friend in the city who has lent the money and Smallweed is just the person collecting the debt. Which leads us on, I suppose, to talking about Mr. George. As I said, Mr. George is a real favourite of mine in this book and a really, really interesting character. He is a swarthy, browned man of 50, well-made and good-looking, with crisp dark hair, brown eyes and a broad chest. His sinewy and powerful hands, as sunburnt as his face, have evidently been used to a pretty rough life. What is curious about him is that he sits forward on his chair as if he were, from long habit, allowing space for some dress or accoutrements that he altogether laid aside. His step, too, is measured and heavy, and would go well with a weighty clash and jingle of spurs. He is close-shaved now, but his mouth is set as if his upper lip had been for many years familiar with a great moustache, and his manner of occasionally laying the open palm of his broad brown hand upon it is to the same effect. Altogether, one might guess Mr. George to have been a trooper once upon a time. Mr. George is an ex-soldier, and we learn quite early on in this chapter that we are to like him, because when Mr. Smallweed starts being horrible to his wife, Mr. George says, "Unlucky old soul, don't scold the old lady. Think of your mother, Mr. Smallweed, if your wife ain't enough." I think we also get a sense of Mr. George's kindness from the impression that whatever money he has to pay Mr. Smallweed is in some way bound up with him doing some service towards his friend. "In the first place," returns Mr. George, "you gentlemen took me in. You advertised that Mr. Horden, Captain Horden, if you hold to the saying, once a captain, always a captain, was to hear something of his advantage. It wouldn't have been much to his advantage to have been clapped into prison by the whole bill and judgment trade of London." Mr. Smallweed says that Captain Horden owed us immense sums, and Mr. George tells us something about Captain Horden's life. "I don't need to be told that he carried on heavily and went to ruin. I have been at his right hand many a day when he was charging upon ruin full gallop. I was with him when he was sick and well, rich and poor. I laid this hand upon him after he had run through everything and broken down everything beneath him, when he held a pistol to his head. That would have been a smash indeed. He had been young, hopeful and handsome in the days gone by, and I'm glad I never found him when he was neither, to lead to a result so much to his advantage." Now I'm going to talk a fair bit as we go through the book about the fact that I think Mr. George is gay. I don't know whether I believe he was intended to be so. I think it's very, very complicated when you're looking at sort of queer characters in books written so long ago. You know, there are some 19th century authors like Oscar Wilde whose characters who appear to be attracted to other characters of the same genre. That's definitely intentional, but there are other authors like Dickens where I don't know that it is intentional, and it's possible that it was, it's possible that it isn't and it just reads like that today, or it's possible that Dickens was writing from observations of relationships that he didn't entirely understand, which I think is one way of often looking at the way that particular characters read from a modern perspective. There is a great book by Holly Fernu called Queer Dickens, and she talks a lot about Mr. George's relationship with Phil Squad, which I'll talk about in a minute, but first I want to also talk about the way he talks about Captain Horden. Now, there is no suggestion that there was any, like, romantic relationship between Mr. George and Captain Horden, definitely the suggestion that there wasn't, but I do think you get a suggestion that Mr. George's love for his friend, something more than just sort of brotherly love. The fact that he says, "I was with him when he was sick and well, rich and poor," which echoes very clearly the marriage vows of a traditional marriage ceremony, which is very, very interesting. And he also talks about Captain Horden as being young, hopeful and handsome, putting that last layer kind of emphasis on his looks. Anyway, I'll be talking a lot about this throughout the book. But let's quickly move on to the relationship between Phil Squad and Mr. George, and just Phil Squad in general. Phil Squad is a very interesting character, and I kind of hadn't remembered that you get introduced to him in the same chapter as Mr. Smallweed, which I think is quite interesting because, as I spoke about in this video I made in Victober about disability within Victorian literature, Charles Dickens's presentation of characters with disabilities is often very, very mixed, and he both makes a lot of use of that Victorian stereotype of villains having disabilities, but also has a lot of very complicated and interesting and good and kind characters with disabilities as well, often within the same book and here within the same chapter. Phil Squad is a very nice character and a complicated and fully realised character, not remotely caricatured, and like Mr. Smallweed, he has a disability and he cannot walk fully unaided. Not that the physical description of him is terribly flattering, but still. A little grotesque man with a large head has it all to himself and lies asleep upon the floor. The little man is dressed something like a gunsmith in a green baize apron and cap, and his hands and face are dirty with gunpowder and begrimed with the loading of guns. As he lies in the light before a glaring white target, the black upon him shines again. Not far off is the strong, rough, primitive table with a vice upon it on which he has been working. He is a little man with a face all crushed together, who appears from a certain blue and speckled appearance that one of his cheeks presents to have been blown up in the way of business at some some odd time or other. And then later, as Phil moves about to execute this order, it appears that he is lame, though able to move very quickly. On the speckled side of his face he has no eyebrow, and on the other side he has a bushy black one, which want of uniformity gives him a very singular and rather sinister appearance. He appears to be very strong and lifts heavy benches about him as if he has no idea what the weight was. He has a curious way of limping round the gallery with his shoulder against the wall and tacking off objects that he wants to lay hold of instead of going straight at them, which has left a smear all round the four walls, conventionally called Phil's mark. Now it's interesting, I think, that Dickens introduces Phil as saying that he has a somewhat sinister appearance, and yet Phil throughout the book is not at all a sinister man and really nice. I like him, I think he's a very interesting character. I spoke quite a lot about the relationship between Phil and George in the video I made last year on LGBTQ+ themes in Victorian literature. There's not too much in this chapter, but there's more later on, which I'll discuss as we get there. But I also like the idea that Phil and George live slightly outside of society. They sleep on mattresses on the floor of George's shooting gallery, and while Phil ostensibly works for George, they also have a kind of nice, fairly friendly relationship. George says to Phil, vagabonding came natural to you from the beginning, the suggestion being that the lives they live are vagabondy in some way, and whether they are just vagabonds / out of Victorian society by the fact that they sleep on the floor of George's shooting gallery, who is to say? Anyway, on to the next chapter. Chapter 22, Mr. Bucket. I'd forgotten it took so long for Mr. Bucket to be introduced. Mr. Bucket, I believe, is one of the first literary detectives, which is quite exciting. The chapter starts off with Mr. Tulkinghorn. Mr. Tulkinghorn is in his office, and he is talking to Mr. Snagsby. And Mr. Snagsby is telling him about what he heard from Joe, about Joe showing a woman round everywhere where Mr. Nemo used to hang out. And Mr. Snagsby becomes aware by the end of this conversation that a man has mysteriously appeared in the room, a man who Mr. Tulkinghorn introduces as Mr. Bucket and says that he is a detective inspector. Mr. Bucket says that he would like to see Joe, and together Mr. Snagsby and Joe go to Tom Allalone's to find Joe out. When they find him in the company of some bricklayers' wives who we met a little earlier on in one of Esther's chapters, and they go back to Mr. Tulkinghorn's office, where when they get through the door, Mr. Snagsby, Mr. Bucket and Joe find a woman veiled, wearing precisely the same clothes as the woman that Joe showed around Mr. Nemo's old lodgings. And then Joe says that's the woman. But when the woman takes off her gloves, Joe says that those aren't her hands, and when the woman talks, Joe says that's not the voice I heard. They send off Joe along with some money, and Mr. Bucket announces that it's all squared, you see. There ain't a doubt that it was the other one with this one's dress on. And after that, Mr. Tulkinghorn dismisses Mr. Snagsby and Mr. Snagsby goes home. So, points of interest in this chapter. Let's quickly talk about the characterisation of Mr. Tulkinghorn, because he's such a fantastic character. Mr. Tulkinghorn sits at one of the open windows enjoying a bottle of old port. Though a hard-grained man, close to dry and silence, he can enjoy old wine with the best. Only old wine, of course, because Mr. Tulkinghorn is old-fashioned, and so of course he wants old wine. And of course he wants respectable wine with a good heritage, just like he likes his old families like the Dedlocks who he respects. Mr. Tulkinghorn, sitting in the twilight by the open window, enjoys his wine. As if it whispered to him of its 50 years of silence and seclusion, it shuts him up the closer, more impenetrable than ever. He sits and drinks and mellows as if it were in secrecy, pondering at that twilight hour on all the mysteries he knows associated with darkening woods in the country and vast blank shut-up houses in town. And then he starts to think, Mr. Tulkinghorn, of that one bachelor friend of his, a man of the same mould and a lawyer too, who lived the same kind of life until he was 75 years old, and then, suddenly conceiving, as it is supposed, an impression that it was too monotonous, gave his gold watch to his hairdresser one summer evening and walked leisurely home to the temple and hanged himself. It's quite a dark shift in tone here in this one paragraph, and really interesting, I think, as well, to look at the character of Mr. Tulkinghorn being this old-fashioned, repressed, closed-up man, but also the sense that it is possible for there to be a lot of misery concealed behind that. And the suggestion that one other man, similar to Mr. Tulkinghorn, one day had enough and just killed himself is really, really powerful and interesting to look at. And whether Mr. Tulkinghorn is dwelling upon this thought with contempt because he would never do such a thing, or thinking about it because sometimes he also feels life is monotonous, it is hard to tell because he is such an impenetrable character. Now let's talk about Mr. Bucket, because he is a fantastic character and really, really interesting, and so nice to encounter an early literary detective, because I love the figure of the detective in literature. Mr. Snagsby is dismayed to see, standing with an attentive face between himself and the lawyer at a little distance from the table, a person with a hat and a stick in his hand who was not there when he himself came in, and has not since entered by the door or either of the windows. There is a press in this room, but its hinges have not creaked, nor has a step been audible upon the floor. Yet this third person stands there with his attentive face in his hat and stick in his hands and his hands behind him, a composed and quiet listener. He is a stoutly built, steady-looking, sharp-eyed man in black, of about the middle age. Except that he looks at Mr. Snagsby as if he were going to take his portrait. There is nothing remarkable about him at first sight but his ghostly manner of appearing. As if he were going to take his portrait. And that's the suggestion that Mr. Bucket is a detective. He is constantly aware and vigilant, and he is looking and judging everyone constantly. I just think it's such an interesting thing to look at. And you get a good sense of Mr. Bucket being quite clever, especially the way in which he effectively makes Mr. Snagsby sort of swear to secrecy, and sort of really emphasises the importance of secrecy, not by telling Mr. Snagsby that he needs to keep this whole affair a secret, but by saying to Mr. Snagsby that he knows he will. It ain't necessary to say to a man like you that it's the best and wisest way to keep little matters like this quiet. You're a man, it's of no use pumping. That's what you are. When you know you've done a right thing, you put it away and it's done with and gone, and that's an end to it. You don't do yourself justice. It ain't what you endeavour to do, it's what you do. We also get a clever moment later where, in order to inform Mr. Tulkinghorn and the woman in the veil that they are coming in, Mr. Bucket takes a long time to turn the key in the lock, which is something that really reminds me a lot of like Poirot and Sherlock Holmes. It's something that you see in a lot of later detective novels, where the detective does something that to everyone else around them looks like they're being a bit silly or a bit clumsy, whereas actually they have a really good like reason for it. It really reminds me of Poirot, which really made me smile. I want to talk a little bit about Tom Allalones and about Jenny and Joe there. We get the impression very much that this is an awful, dreadful place to be, and Dickens' kind of social criticism comes to the fore again here. Between his two conductors, Mr. Snagsby passes along the middle of a villainous street, undrained, unventilated, deep in black mud and corrupt water, though the roads were dry elsewhere, and reeking with such smells and sights that he, who had lived in London all his life, can scarce believe his senses. Branching from this street and its heaps of ruins are other streets and courts so infamous that Mr. Snagsby sickens in body and mind and feels as if he were going every moment deeper down into the eternal gulf. There is a fever spreading round this place, and one of the men reports that the people have been down by dozens and been carried out dead and dying like sheep with the rot. This idea that the very poverty of these people has meant that they have been dehumanised in the eyes of the rest of the world. It's such a horrible, awful situation, such a terrible place to be, and these people really are very desperate. We meet again the brickmakers and their wives that we met near Bleak House when Esther met them earlier on. Dickens goes to some pains to remind the readers that these are the same people. Not only do we get the repeated characters' names, we're also told again about the moment of the death of Jenny's child, which was described so vividly by Esther earlier on in the book. And when Jenny and Liz go over the death of Jenny's child, it's not just to remind us readers who these characters are, it's also to show the awful, dreadful lives that these two women live. You seem as fond of it as if you were the mother yourself, says Mr. Bucket. I was the mother of one like it, master, and it died. Ah, Jenny, Jenny, says the other woman to her. Better so. Much better to think of dead than alive, Jenny, much better. Mr. Bucket tells her that she should train her son to be a comfort to her, and she says, I mean to try hard, but I've been a-thinking and overtired tonight and not well with the ague of all the many things that'll come in his way. My master will be against it, and he'll be beat and see me beat, and made to fear his home and perhaps to stray wild. If I work for him ever so much and ever so hard, there's no one to help me. If he should be turned bad, spite of all I could do, and the time should come when I should sit by him in his sleep, made hard and changed, ain't it likely I should think of him as he lies in my lap now and wish he had died as Jenny's child died? I feel like one of the most heart-wrenching things about Jenny and Liz as characters, the way their husbands treat them, and the fact that they call their husbands my master and live in fear of the men they are married to. Let's talk a little bit about Joe and the incident with the woman in the veil. Joe is called there to identify this woman. He says when he first sees the woman in the veil and the bonnet that it is her because he recognises the clothes. Then when she speaks and when she takes off her gloves, he says that it is definitely not her. And we find out after Joe has left the room that who it is not whoever Joe saw, but Mademoiselle Hortense, Lady Dedlock's maid. Before she leaves, she asks Mr. Tulkinghorn to remember that she is in want of a situation and to offer his recommendation as possible, and then Mr. Tulkinghorn turns to Bucket. Well, Bucket, it's all squared, you see, as I squared it myself, sir. There ain't a doubt that it was the other one with this one's dress on. And off goes Mr. Snagsby into the night rather confused. So much confused that he is doubtful of his being awake and out, doubtful of the reality of the streets through which he goes, doubtful of the reality of the moon that shines above him. Because that is how strange and nonsensical the evening has been to him. But hopefully it sheds rather more light for us readers. So that is all I have to say on that chapter, which means that is all I have to say for today. I'm sorry this video is so late, and hopefully October October's will be up in the next couple of weeks. Thank you so much for bearing with me. I hope you're all still really continuing to enjoy Bleak House. In the month of October, we were reading chapter 23, Esther's narrative, chapter 24, An Appeal Case, and chapter 25, Mrs. Snagsby Sees It All, which I'll be talking about next time. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.